Chapter 8, Part 1 of Fanny Herself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fanny Herself by Edna Ferber. Chapter 8, Part 1. You can come down now. They're all here, I guess. Dr. Thalmann's going to begin. Fanny, huddled in a chair in her bedroom, looked up into the plump, kindly face of the woman who was bending over her. Then she stood up, docilely, and walked toward the stairs with a heavy, stumbling step. "I'd put down my veil if I were you," said the neighbor woman, and reached up for the black folds that draped Fanny's hat. Fanny's fingers reached for them too, fumblingly. "I'd forgotten about that," she said. The heavy crape fell about her shoulders, mercifully hiding the swollen, discolored face. She went down the stairs. There was a little stir, a swaying toward her, a sibilant murmur of sympathy from the crowded sitting room as she passed into the parlor where Rabbi Thalmann stood waiting, prayer book in hand, in front of that which was covered with flowers. Fanny sat down. A feeling of unreality was strong upon her. Dr. Thalmann cleared his throat and opened the book. After all, it was not Rabbi Thalmann's funeral sermon that testified to Mrs. Brandeis's standing in the community. It was the character of the gathering that listened to what he had to say. Each had his own opinion of Molly Brandeis, and needed no final eulogy to confirm it. Father Fitzpatrick was there, tall, handsome, ruddy, the two wings of white showing at the temples, making him look more than ever like a leading man. He had been of those who had sat in what he called Mrs. Brandeis's confessional, there in the quiet little store. The two had talked of things theological and things earthly. His wit, quick though it was no match for hers, but they both had a humor sense and a drama sense, and one day they discovered, queerly enough, that they worshiped the same God. Any one of these things is basis enough for a friendship. Besides, Molly Brandeis could tell an Irish story inimitably, and you should have heard Father Fitzpatrick do the one about Ikey and the nickel. No, I think the Catholic priest, seeming to listen with such respectful attention, really heard very little of what Rabbi Thalmann had to say. Herman Walthers was there, he of the First National Bank of Winnebago, whose visits had once brought such terror to Molly Brandeis. Augustus G. Gerritsen was there, and three of his department heads. Emil Bauer sat just behind him. In a corner was Sadie, the erstwhile coquette, very subdued now, and months behind the fashions in everything but baby clothes. Hen Cody, who had done all of Molly Brandeis's draying, sat in unaccustomed black next to Mayor A. J. Dawes. Temple Emmanuel was there, almost a unit. The officers of Temple Emmanuel's Ladies' Aid Society sat in a row. They had never honored Molly Brandeis with office in the society, she who could have managed its business, politics, and social activities with one hand tied behind her, and both her bright eyes shut. In the kitchen and on the porch and in the hallway stood certain obscure people, women whose fingertips stuck out of their cotton gloves, and whose skirts dipped ludicrously in the back. Only Molly Brandeis could have identified them for you. Mrs. Brosh, the butter and egg woman, hovered in the dining room doorway. She had brought a pound of butter. It was her contribution to the funeral baked meats. She had deposited it furtively on the kitchen table. Bertie Callahan, head waitress at the Halley House, found a seat just next to the elegant Mrs. Morehouse, who led the golf club crowd. A haughty young lady in the dining room, Bertie Callahan, in her stiffly starched white, but beneath the icy crust of her hauteur was a molten mass of good humor and friendliness. She and Molly Brandeis had had much in common. But no one, not even Fanny Brandeis, ever knew who sent the great cluster of American Beauty roses that had come all the way from Milwaukee. There had been no card, so who could have guessed that they came from Blanche Devine? Blanche Devine of the white powder and the minks and the diamonds and the high-heeled shoes and the plumes lived in the house with the closed shutters near the freight depot. She often came into Brandeis's bazaar. Molly Brandeis had never allowed Sadie or Pearl or Fanny or Aloysius to wait on her. She had attended to her herself. And one day, for some reason, Blanche Devine found herself telling Molly Brandeis how she had come to be Blanche Devine, and it was a moving and terrible story. And now her cardless flowers, a great scarlet sheaf of them, lay next to the chaste white roses that had been sent by the Temple Emmanuel Ladies' Aid. Truly, death is a great leveler. In a vague way, Fanny seemed to realize that all these people were there. I think she must even have found a certain grim comfort in their presence. Hers had not been the dry-eyed grief of the strong, such as you read about. She had wept, night and day, hopelessly, inconsolably, torturing herself with remorseful questions. If she had not gone skating, might she not have seen how ill her mother was? Why hadn't she insisted on the doctor when her mother refused to eat the Christmas dinner? Blind and selfish, she told herself. Blind and selfish. Her face was swollen and distorted now, and she was thankful for the black veil that shielded her. Winnebago was scandalized to see that she wore no other black. Mrs. Brandeis had never wanted Fanny to wear it. She hadn't enough color, she said. So now she was dressed in her winter suit of blue, and her hat with the pert blue quill. And the little rabbi's voice went on, and Fanny knew that it could not be true. What had all this dust-to-dust talk to do with anyone as vital and electric and constructive as Molly Brandeis? In the midst of the service there was a sharp cry, and a little stir, and the sound of stifled sobbing. It was Aloysius the merry, Aloysius the faithful, whose Irish heart was quite broken. Fanny ground her teeth together in an effort at self-control. And so to the end, and out past the little hushed, respectful group on the porch, to the Jewish cemetery on the state road. The snow of Christmas week was quite virgin there, except for that one spot where the sexton and his men had been at work. Then back at a smart jog-trot through the early dusk of the winter afternoon, the carriage wheels creaking upon the hard, dry snow. And Fanny Brandeis said to herself, she must have been a little light-headed from hunger and weeping, "Now I'll know whether it's true or not. When I go into the house, if she's there, she'll say, 'Well, Fanchen, hungry?' Oh, but my little girl's hands are cold. Come here to the register and warm them. Oh, God, let her be there. Let her be there." But she wasn't. The house had been set to rights by brisk and unaccustomed hands. There was a bustle and stir in the dining room, and from the kitchen came the appetizing odors of cooking food. Fanny went up to a chair that was out of its place and shoved it back against the wall where it belonged. She straightened a rug, carried the wastebasket from the desk to the spot near the living-room table where it had always served to hide the shabby worn place in the rug. Fanny went upstairs, past the room, that was once more just a comfortable, old-fashioned bedroom instead of a mysterious and awful chamber, bathed her face, tidied her hair, came downstairs again, ate and drank things hot and revivifying. The house was full of kindly women. Fanny found herself clinging to them, clinging desperately to these ample, broad-bosomed, soothing women whom she had scarcely known before. They were always there, those women, and their husbands, too, kindly, awkward men who patted her shoulder and who spoke of Molly Brandeis with that sincerity of admiration such as men usually give only to men. People were constantly popping in at the back door with napkin-covered trays and dishes and baskets. A wonderful and beautiful thing, that homely, small-town sympathy that knows the value of physical comfort in the time of spiritual anguish. 2 days after the funeral, Fanny Brandeis went back to the store, much as her mother had done many years before, after her husband's death. She looked about at the bright, well-stocked shelves and tables with a new eye, a speculative eye. The Christmas season was over. January was the time for inventory and for replenishment. Mrs. Brandeis had always gone to Chicago the second week in January for the spring stock. But something was forming in Fanny Brandeis's mind, a resolve that grew so rapidly as to take her breath away. Her brain felt strangely clear and keen after the crashing storm of grief that had shaken her during the past week. "What are you going to do now?" people had asked her, curious and interested. "Is Theodore coming back?" "I don't know, yet," in answer to the first, and, "No, why should he? He has his work." "But he could be of such help to you." "I'll help myself," said Fanny Brandeis, and smiled a curious smile that had in it more of bitterness and less of mirth than any smile has a right to have. Mrs. Brandeis left a will, far-sighted businesswoman that she was. It was a terse, clear-headed document that gave to Fanny Brandeis, my daughter, the $6,000 insurance, the stock, goodwill, and fixtures of Brandeis's Bazaar, the house furnishings, the few pieces of jewelry in their old-fashioned setting. To Theodore was left the sum of $1,500. He had received his share in the years of his musical education. Fanny Brandeis did not go to Chicago that January. She took inventory of Brandeis's Bazaar, carefully and minutely. And then, just as carefully and minutely, she took stock of Fanny Brandeis. There was something relentless and terrible in the way she went about this self-analysis. She walked a great deal that winter, often out through the drifts to the little cemetery. As she walked, her mind was working, working. She held long mental conversations with herself during these walks, and once she was rather frightened to find herself talking aloud. She wondered if she had done that before. And a plan was maturing in her brain, while the fight went on within herself, thus: "You'll never do it, Fanny. You're not built that way. Oh, won't I? Watch me. Give me time. You'll think of what your mother would have done under the same conditions, and you'll do that thing. I won't. Not unless it's the long-headed thing to do. I'm through being sentimental and unselfish. What did it bring her? Nothing." The weeks went by. Fanny worked hard in the store and bought little. February came, and with the spring her months of private thinking bore fruit. There came to Fanny Brandeis a great resolve. She would put herself in a high place. Every talent she possessed, every advantage, every scrap of knowledge, every bit of experience, would be used toward that end. She would make something of herself. It was a worldly, selfish resolve, born of a bitter sorrow, and ambition, and resentment. She made up her mind that she would admit no handicaps. Race, religion, training, natural impulses. She would discard them all if they stood in her way. She would leave Winnebago behind. At best, if she stayed there, she would never accomplish more than to make her business a more than ordinarily successful small-town store. And she would be nobody. No, she had had enough of that. She would crush and destroy the little girl who had fasted on that Day of Atonement, the more mature girl who had written the thesis about the paper mill rag room, the young woman who had drudged in the store on Elm Street. In her place she would mold a hard, keen-eyed, resolute woman, whose godhead was to be success, and to whom success would mean money and position. She had not a head for mathematics, but out of the puzzling problems and syllogisms in geometry she had retained in her memory this one immovable truth: a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. With her mental eye she marked her 2 points, and then, starting from the first, made directly for the second. But she forgot to reckon with the law of tangents. She forgot, too, how paradoxical a creature was this Fanny Brandeis, whose eyes filled with tears at the sight of a parade, just the sheer drama of it, where the marchers, GAR veterans, school children in white, soldiers, foresters, political marching clubs, and whose eyes burned dry and bright, as she stood over the white mound in the cemetery on the state road. Generous, spontaneous, impulsive, warm-hearted, she would be cold, calculating, deliberate, she told herself. Thousands of years of persecution behind her made her quick to appreciate suffering in others, and gave her an innate sense of fellowship with the downtrodden. She resolved to use that sense as a searchlight, aiding her to see and overcome obstacles. She told herself that she was done with maudlin sentimentality. On the rare occasions when she had accompanied her mother to Chicago, the two women had found delight in wandering about the city's foreign quarters. When other small-town women buyers snatched occasional moments of leisure for the theater or personal shopping, these two had spent hours in the ghetto around Jefferson and Taylor and 14th Streets. Something in the sight of these people, alien, hopeful, emotional, often grotesque, thrilled and interested both the women. And at the sight of an ill-clad Italian, with his slovenly, wrinkled old young wife, turning the handle of his grind organ, whilst both pairs of eyes searched windows and porches and doorsteps with a hopeless sort of hopefulness, she lost her head entirely and emptied her limp pocketbook of dimes and nickels and pennies. Incidentally, it might be stated that she loved the cheap and florid music of the hand organ itself. It was rumored that Brandeis's Bazaar was for sale. In the spring, Gerritson's offered Fanny the position of buyer and head of the china, glassware, and kitchenware sections. Gerritson's showed an imposing block of gleaming plate glass front now, and drew custom from a dozen thrifty little towns throughout the Fox River Valley. Fanny refused the offer. In March she sold outright the stock, goodwill, and fixtures of Brandeis's Bazaar. The purchaser was a thrifty, far-sighted traveling man who had wearied of the road and wanted to settle down. She sold the household goods, too, those intimate personal pieces of wood and cloth that had become, somehow, part of her life. She had grown up with them. She knew the history of every nick, every scratch and worn spot. Her mother lived again in every piece. The old couch went off in a farmer's wagon. Fanny turned away when they joggled it down the front steps and into the rude vehicle. It was like another funeral. She was furious to find herself weeping again. She promised herself punishment for that. Up in her bedroom she opened the bottom drawer of her bureau. That bureau and its history, and the history of every piece of furniture in the room, bore mute testimony to the character of its occupant, to her protest against things as she found them, and her determination to make them over to suit her. She had spent innumerable Sunday mornings wielding the magic paintbrush that had transformed the bedroom from a dingy oak to a gleaming cream enamel. She sat down on the floor now before the bureau and opened the bottom drawer. In a corner at the back, under the neat pile of garments, was a tightly rolled bundle of cloth. Fanny reached for it, took it out, and held it in her hands a moment. Then she unrolled it slowly, and the bundle revealed itself to be a faded, stained, voluminous gingham apron, blue and white. It was the kind of apron women don when they perform some very special household ritual, baking, preserving, house cleaning. It crossed over the shoulders with straps, and its generous fullness ran all the way around the waist. It was discolored in many places with the brown and reddish stains of fruit juices. It had been Molly Brandeis's canning apron. Fanny had come upon it hanging on a hook behind the kitchen door after that week in December, and at the sight of it her fortitude and forced calm had fled. She had spread her arms over the limp, mute, yet speaking thing dangling there, and had wept so wildly and uncontrollably as to alarm even herself. Nothing in connection with her mother's death had power to call up such poignant memories as did this homely, intimate garment. She saw again the steamy kitchen, deliciously scented with the perfume of cooking fruit, or the tantalizing, mouth-watering spiciness of vinegar and pickles. On the stove, the big dishpan in which the jelly glasses and fruit jars, with their tops and rubbers, bobbed about in hot water. In the great granite kettle simmered the cooking fruit. Molly Brandeis, enveloped in the familiar blue and white apron, stood over it like a priestess, stirring, slowly, rhythmically. Her face would be hot and moist with the steam, and very tired, too, for she often came home from the store utterly weary, to stand over the kettle until 10 or 11 o'clock. But the pride in it as she counted the golden or ruby-tinted tumblers gleaming in orderly rows as they cooled on the kitchen table. 15 glasses of grape jell, Fan, and I didn't mix a bit of apple with it. I didn't think I'd get more than 10. And 9 of the quince preserve. That makes, let me see, 83, 98, 107 altogether. We'll never eat it, Mother. You said that last year, and by April my preserve cupboard looked like old Mother Hubbard's. But then Mrs. Brandeis was famous for her preserves, as Father Fitzpatrick and Aloysius and Dr. Thalmann and a dozen others could testify. After the strain and flurry of a busy day at the store, there was something about this homely household rite that brought a certain sense of rest and peace to Molly Brandeis. All this moved through Fanny Brandeis's mind as she sat with the crumpled apron in her lap, her eyes swimming with hot tears. The very stains that discolored it, the faded blue of the front breadth, the frayed buttonhole, the little scorched place where she had burned a hole while trying unwisely to lift a steaming kettle from the stove with the apron's corner, spoke to her with eloquent lips. That apron had become a vice with Fanny. She brooded over it as a mother broods over the shapeless, scuffed bit of leather that was a baby's shoe, as a woman, widowed, clings to a shabby, frayed old smoking jacket. More than once she had cried herself to sleep, with the apron clasped tightly in her arms. She got up from the floor now, with the apron in her hands, and went down the stairs, opened the door that led to the cellar, walked heavily down those steps, and over to the furnace. She flung open the furnace door. Red and purple the coal bed gleamed, with little white flame sprites dancing over it. Fanny stared at it a moment, fascinated. Her face was set, her eyes brilliant. Suddenly she flung the tightly rolled apron into the heart of the gleaming mass. She shut her eyes then. The fire seemed to hold its breath for a moment. Then, with a gasp, it sprang upon its food. The bundle stiffened, writhed, crumpled, sank, lay a blackened heap, was dissolved. The firebed glowed red and purple as before, except for a dark spot in its heart. Fanny shivered a little. She shut the furnace door and went upstairs again. "Smells like something burning, cloth or something," called Annie from the kitchen. "It's only an old apron that was cluttering up my bureau drawer." Thus she successfully demonstrated the first lesson in the cruel and rigid course of mental training she had mapped out for herself. Leaving Winnebago was not easy. There is something about a small town that holds you. Your life is so intimately interwoven with that of your neighbor. Existence is so safe, so sane, so sure. Fanny knew that when she turned the corner of Elm Street every third person she met would speak to her. Life was made up of minute details, too trivial for the notice of the hurrying city crowds. You knew when Millie Glasner changed the baby buggy for a go-kart. The youngest Hupp boy, Sammy, who was graduated from high school in June, is driving A.J. Dawes's automobile now. My goodness, how time flies! Doppler's grocery has put in plate glass windows, and they're getting out-of-season vegetables every day now from Milwaukee. As you pass, you get the coral glow of tomatoes and the tender green of lettuces. And that vivid green? Fresh young peas. And in February, well! They've torn down the old yellow brick National Bank, and in its place a chaste Greek temple of a building looks rather contemptuously down its classic columns upon the farmers' wagons drawn up along the curb. If Fanny Brandeis's sense of proportion had not been out of plumb, she might have realized that, to Winnebago, the new First National Bank building was as significant and epochal as had been the Woolworth building to New York. The very intimacy of these details, Fanny argued, was another reason for leaving Winnebago. They were like detaining fingers that grasped at your skirts, impeding your progress. She had early set about pulling every wire within her reach that might lead, directly or indirectly, to the furtherance of her ambition. She got 2 offers from Milwaukee retail stores. She did not consider them for a moment. Even a Chicago department store of the second grade, one of those on the wrong side of State Street, did not tempt her. She knew her value. She could afford to wait. There was money enough on which to live comfortably until the right chance presented itself. She knew every item of her equipment, and she conned them to herself greedily. Despite charm of manner, the thing that is called magnetism, brains, imagination, driving force, health, youth, and most precious of all, that which money could not buy, nor education provide, experience. Experience, a priceless weapon, that is beaten into shape only by much contact with men and women, and that is sharpened by much rubbing against the rough edges of this world. In April her chance came to her. Came in that accidental, haphazard way that momentous happenings have. She met on Elm Street a traveling man from whom Molly Brandeis had bought for years. He dropped both sample cases and shook hands with Fanny, eyeing her expertly and approvingly, and yet without insolence. He was a wise, road-weary, skillful member of his fraternity, growing gray in years of service, and a little bitter. Though perhaps that was due partly to traveling man's dyspepsia, brought on by years of small-town hotel food. "So you've sold out?" "Yes, over a month ago." That was a nice little business you had there. Your ma built it up herself." There was a woman. Gosh! Discounted her bills even during the panic. Fanny smiled a reflective little smile. That line is a complete characterization of my mother. Her life was a series of panics. But she never lost her head, and she always discounted. He held out his hand. "Well, glad I met you." He picked up his sample cases. "You leaving Winnebago?" "Yes." "Going to the city, I suppose. Well, you're a smart girl, and your mother's daughter. I guess you'll get along all right. What house are you going with?" "I don't know. I'm waiting for the right chance. It's all in starting right. I'm not going to hurry." He put down his cases again, and his eyes grew keen and kindly. He gesticulated with one broad forefinger. "Listen, m' girl, I'm what they call an old-timer. They want these high-power, 8-cylinder kids on the road these days, and it's all we can do to keep up. But I've got something they haven't got, yet. I never read anybody on the psychology of business, but I know human nature all the way from Elm Street, Winnebago, to Fifth Avenue, New York." "I'm sure you do," said Fanny politely, and took a step forward as though to end the conversation. "Now wait a minute. They say the way to learn is to make mistakes. If that's true, I'm at the head of the class. I've made 'em all. Now get this. You start out and specialize. Specialize. Tie to one thing and make yourself an expert in it, but first be sure it's the right thing." "But how is one to be sure?" "By squinting up your eyes so you can see 10 years ahead. If it looks good to you at that distance, better, in fact, than it does close by, then it's right. I suppose that's what they call having imagination. I never had any. That's why I'm still selling goods on the road. To look at you, I'd say you had too much. Maybe I'm wrong. But I never yet saw a woman with a mouth like yours who was cut out for business, unless it was your mother, and her eyes were different. Let's see, what was I saying?" "Specialize." "Oh, yes. And that reminds me. Bunch of fellows in the smoker last night talking about Haynes Cooper. Your mother hated 'em like poison, the way every small town merchant hates the mail order houses. But I hear they've got an infants' wear department that's just going to grass for a lack of a proper head. You're only a kid, and they've done you dirt all these years, of course. But if you could sort of horn in there, why, say, there's no limit to the distance you could go. No limit! With your brains and experience." That had been the beginning. From then on the thing had moved forward with a certain inevitableness. There was something about the vastness of the thing that appealed to Fanny. Here was an organization whose great arms embraced the world. Haynes Cooper, giant among mail order houses, was said to eat a small town merchant every morning for breakfast. "There's a Haynes Cooper catalog in every farmer's kitchen," Molly Brandeis used to say. "The Bible's in the parlor, but they keep the H.C. book in the room where they live." That she was about to affiliate herself with this house appealed to Fanny Brandeis's sense of comedy. She had heard her mother presenting her arguments to the stubborn farmer folk who insisted on ordering their stove, or dinner set, or plow, or kitchen goods from the fascinating catalog. "I honestly think it's just the craving for excitement that makes them do it," she often said. "They want the thrill they get when they receive a box from Chicago, and open it, and take off the wrappings, and dig out the thing they ordered from a picture, and not knowing whether it will be right or wrong." Her arguments usually left the farmer unmoved. He would drive into town, mail his painfully written letter, and order at the post office, dispose of his load of apples or butter or cheese or vegetables, and drive cheerfully back again, his empty wagon bumping and rattling down the old corduroy road. Express, breakage, risk, loyalty to his own region, all these arguments left him cold. In May, after much manipulation, correspondence, 2 interviews, came a definite offer from the Haynes Cooper Company. It was much less than the State Street store had offered, and there was something tentative about the whole agreement. Haynes Cooper proffered little and demanded much, as is the way of the rich and mighty. But Fanny remembered the 10-year viewpoint that the weary wise old traveling man had spoken about. She took their offer. She was to go to Chicago almost at once, to begin work June 1st. End of Part 1 of Chapter 8.